Okay, welcome everyone to our panel on working together as different stakeholders. We've already heard today about the ambitious plans for improving cancer control across Europe. Part of those plans were put together through multi-stakeholder collaboration, and their delivery is going to critically require stakeholders to come together. But which stakeholders, and how are we to improve the way that stakeholders work together? What are their roles and responsibilities? That's what we're here to discuss. And joining me in conversation for that, I'm delighted to welcome John Halamka, who is president of the Mayo Clinic platform, Antonella Cardoni, director of the European Cancer Patients Coalition, Stephanie Granado, head of EU Can Oncology Business Unit, Takeda, and Rose Nguyen, who's investment manager for health innovation at Baillie Gifford. So welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for this really important conversation, which really gets to the heart of how we're going to implement our aspirations that are laid out in the European Cancer Plan, and also what we want as patients and as citizens. So I'm going to start with you, Antonella. I think as the voice, as it were, on this panel, at least for patients. Speaking of the European Cancer Patients Coalition, why do we need stakeholders to work together? What will it achieve in the context of the European plans? Why do we need this to happen, and what do you hope for it?
Well, thank you, Vivek. Even the last happenings in the world, like the COVID-19 pandemic, have shown that alone we don't go anywhere. We need to work all together in order to achieve the best outcomes for patients, and specifically for cancer patients. And so working together, we can achieve more. Working together will optimize the efforts of each single component of the stakeholder groups. And also working together, we avoid duplicating the effort and wasting resources. So I think that this is really why we all need to work together, as mostly once we have the same objective and goal.
Mm-hmm. And when you say we, who do you see as the critical stakeholders that need to participate here?
Definitely patients, so cancer patients, then policy makers, the industry. So those are the what I see as the major stakeholders, including academics, researchers, because research is a fundamental item towards reaching, the benefits for the patients. So patients. The industry, policymakers, and researchers, academics.
Okay, thank you. So Rose, I'm going to come to you next, because I think, in a way, because you represent sort of you're the capital markets representative, I suppose, in all of this, and there's a very high level question, which is all of the roles of the public and the private sector here, and the role of markets in enabling better cancer control. What do you see as that interplay? Because sometimes they're not aligned, and there can be market failures, which lead to suboptimal cancer control. And what do you see as the ways of improving alignment, and where do you see as the critical areas where markets can operate and be really effective in delivering better cancer control?
Yeah, so thank you, Vivek, for the question. So I think we are standing in a very interesting time with regard to cancer care. As we look to the life sciences industry, we are witnessing an exploding pace of innovation in life sciences. And that is thanks to the convergence of many different technologies, and this gives rise to many transformative medicines. However, from the perspective of the investors, what we often see is that there is sometimes a tension there between what the private sector aims to achieve and what the public sector hopes in terms of outcomes. the rise of many transformative medicines sometimes comes with very high price tags, and this gives rise to that tension between profits and access. And so we see ourselves as long-term investors, and we see our role as both to allocate capital to the best and the most innovative companies that can solve big problems for society. But we also see our role as bringing, the impact to the society, and broadening access for patients in terms of those transformative medicines. So I think what we need to do to bring greater alignment between the private and the public sector. First is communication and intent. So we need both sides to agree on, what is the outcomes that we want to achieve, right? And I think in terms of cancer care, I think we really want to aim for cures instead of, incrementally extending patient lives by a matter of weeks, for example. And so for us, we are really looking to invest in companies that have the ambition to look at cancer care in a very different way, have the ambition to do research, differently, to really aim for that cure outcomes. So just to give you, a short example, there is a company that we invest in that is developing curative cell therapies for solid tumors. And we know that, the tumor microenvironment is a huge challenge for treatments. And to study that, the company took almost 2 years to mimic that tumor microenvironment in a mouse model instead of using off-the-shelf models that are cheaper but do not generate as much insight. So it took them 2 years, right? That's very time-consuming, labor-intensive, and costly. We as investors need to understand that that's what it takes to get to cures, hopefully. And so we need to be prepared to support those companies with long-term investment horizons and ample financing. So I think that's what, the private sector needs to do. And for the public sector, when it comes to payers and, policymakers, we also need to get together and come up with better, reimbursement models, for example, because those transformative medicines are coming, they are here, but we are not yet, able to come up with optimal payment models for those types of medicines. So that's my thought.
Okay. Thank you. So I think that then it's timely then to go to Stephanie, I suspect, and then ask, well, what is the role and responsibility? What do you see as the role and responsibility of industry in participating in improved? I mean, the big focus for the European Beating Cancer Plan is equity and improved access to, I guess I would call it improved access to optimal outcome rather than any particular medicine or any particular. So. What do you see as the pharma industry and broadly the biotech industry's response to that?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think part of it fits very nicely in what Rose just said, because for us it's really, and I speak now for Takeda, but I assume this is the aspiration for the rest of the industry as well. It's really the aspiration to cure cancer, right? That's where we see our responsibility. And what we understand very clearly is we cannot do that by ourselves. It's such a big task that we really have to work collaboratively. And we really ask for this shared responsibility, as Antonella mentioned. And if I look at the colleagues that are on the panel with me today, it's really an honor to be here and to have these discussions. And maybe I would add to what Antonella said, we really need to have these discussions as early as possible. So if we start to designing our development programs, if we start to design our trials, that's when we reach out to the agencies. That's when we reach out to the regulators, to the HTA bodies, to really seek their advice and understand how should we set up our endpoints, how should we choose our comparators. So collaboration is the first thing, and have it as early as possible, as broad as we have it here on this panel. And then the second responsibility that we have as an industry is really to put the patient in everything we do, to put the patient first. And at Takeda, we actually have a tool which helps us doing that. If we have to take a decision, any decision, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean for the patients first? Does that help us to build further trust in Takeda? Does it make our reputation grow? And will it then ultimately, so not as a first position, but ultimately lead us to business? So this patient trust, reputation, business is a bit like a mantra for us. But I think it's the responsibility of the industry to do it that way. Otherwise, we will not generate the outcomes you mentioned that patients, especially patients with cancer, need so much.
Thank you. So John, I know you work. Maybe I can ask you about the role of. We've discussed payers, we've discussed policymakers, researchers, the biotech, biopharmaceutical industry, and also patients. But John, I know you're working a lot in the tech space and in terms of AI and data analytics. They're clearly key, and there are many initiatives sort of surrounding the European Beating Cancer Plan that are around that participation. And in fact, we have some days coming up in this conference. But John, let's look across the pond. I know you're doing a lot of work to drive that aspect of collaboration and that data and data analytics part. So perhaps you could describe a little bit about what the role is there.
Well, absolutely, and thanks for the question. So at Mayo Clinic, as Stephanie actually told us, the patient always comes first. And so ask yourself the question, if you're a cancer patient, what cure, what treatment do you want? What are your care preferences? And how are we going to ensure you get the best evidence-based treatment for your disease? My wife was diagnosed with stage 3A breast cancer in December of 2011. She's doing fine today. At the time, she was 50. She's Korean. She had stage 3A with one met to the left axilla. Was there randomized clinical trial evidence that suggested the best treatment for her? The answer is no. But there was real-world evidence of thousands of Asian women receiving breast cancer treatment that we could use to tailor her specific treatment to maximize the result and minimize side effects. What did we do? At that time, I was the CIO of a Harvard hospital and Harvard Medical School. So we assembled all of the data from Dana-Farber, Mass General, Beth Israel Deaconess, and others to come up with a care plan tailored for her. We ended up reducing her dose of Taxol by 50% and achieving cure with very few side effects. At Mayo Clinic, my role as president of Platform is to ask what are the collaborations we need to bring real-world evidence together. So that means it's government, academia, and industry. It's working across payers and pharma and providers to assemble that data, making sure that the data is complete and curated. And cancer data can be quite complex, so there are many tools and techniques needed to get us biomarkers and get us the genomics and other omics or exposome data we need. And once we have that, to generate equitable AI tools that take into account social determinants of health and differences in income, education, geography, so that we give that patient the exact cure that they are going to want. And that is, to me, the way all of us have to come together in a non-traditional way, focused on precision medicine that starts with gathering data.
Interesting. Very good. It's a really good way into. I think we could just dive straight in. One of the questions that I want to ask, and I think among you all, you've identified some of these. The key principles around, if we were to write a compact about how stakeholders should operate, the stakeholders that we've described, what would be the key principles? And just to get the ball rolling, here's some things I've heard. One is about signaling the desired outcomes in advance. So actually creating the opportunity for what is it we're aligning for? Improved outcomes, cures, better prevention, perhaps greater equity. But that's being signaled by, if you like, the marketplace. Identifying which stakeholders we need to bring into the tent. Having capability to share data, generate and share real world data might be another one. And then things around perhaps how innovators are rewarded, what the reimbursement mechanisms are for delivering against those original outcomes. I mean, these are things I've heard, but I'd just be interested, and this is a question to anyone who wants to chip in, if we're to write a kind of charter for how stakeholders should collaborate, what might be the kind of key chapter headings within that, or the heads of terms within that. Anyone want to give me a shout? Yes, Antonella. Yeah.
Well, I think that before getting into the specific items of what needs to be done, so the principles should be transparency, first of all, among all the different stakeholders. And this is, transparency is essential to build a trustful relationship among the stakeholders. And a trustful relationship is the basis to develop a mutual collaboration. And then I would also add that we need to increase health literacy among all the stakeholders. I mean, we now give it for granted, for instance, that governments, policymakers, but sometimes even researchers, academics have have a need to increase their health literacy, and then of course patients. And so we do need. We all have we as people who are already sensitized on these priorities have a role here to play to make sure that there is an increased health literacy among all the relevant stakeholders, including policymakers and patients.
Okay, so that's underlying principles: transparency, health literacy. Anyone else want to chip in on either other underlying principles, or actually into the mechanics of what might be in this sort of stakeholder collaboration sort of principles?
The way I divide up such things is thinking about technology, policy, and culture. So on the technology side, of course, as you say, we are going to, if we gather data, because I've been chatting about data, do so in a privacy-protecting, ethical fashion with great transparency and communication to stakeholders as to what we're doing and why we're doing it. Mayo Clinic has de-identified 10 million longitudinal patient experiences and has told the world publicly how we're going to use that data, never selling it, but to develop new care plans and cures. Policy is really quite important. So does GDPR restrict our uses of this data? What are the consents that we are needing? How do we minimize risk? How do we send data across different borders if that's necessary? And culture. Does everyone understand why we're doing this? I think back to care.data and some early attempts at aggregating data in the UK, making sure people understand that this is truly for the benefit of the patient and the goodness of society.
Maybe I can add.
Oh, okay. Let me go. Sorry, now Stephanie first, and then Rose. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Stephanie, go
Just
ahead.
quickly add to emphasize again the point about true collaboration, right? And that means bringing all the stakeholders around the table and not just listen, but then co-create. John was mentioning the importance of real-world evidence, right? That's something that as an industry we had to embark a couple of years ago, but it was new. So now, for example, in Takeda, we work with a local network of hospitals in Canada where we gather data on lung cancer patients with a rare mutation beyond what was the approval, beyond what was the reimbursement, but now to really understand what does it mean for them living with this condition and seeking treatment. We have a project going on that started in Germany and now we try to expand across the region, really about mutual decision making. So where we gather the input from the patients and then discuss with the healthcare professionals much more, what does it mean for them? What do they need to know? What do their families need to know? What do they want? And us as an industry being really part of these collaborative discussions. Another project where we develop a tool which was not so far available for patient-reported outcomes. To be part of this project is really enriching, and I'm convinced that's when we really make a difference for patient outcomes. So I would emphasize the principle of true collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Rose.
Yes, so I would like to add to what Antonella and Stephanie have just mentioned about the key principles for this compact between multiple stakeholders. And I think we need to emphasize the time horizons that we are all working towards to. I think that's very important to bear in mind because different parties may have different time horizons in mind. And for example, as a regulator or a policy maker, if you want to show that you are reducing cancer deaths within your time in the office, you may want to focus more on treatments that can extend patient lives and reduce deaths. But I think over the very long term, 10, 20 years and more that and beyond that, if we really want to get to cures, we need to emphasize a lot more on prevention. Because if we can detect and diagnose cancers at a very early stage, we can increase significantly the chance of eliminating those cancers and curing patients. And so prevention, I think, is oftentimes neglected when it comes to discussion between policymakers and the industry. And it's reflecting the current status of the industry we are today. There's so much money, so much capital and efforts focusing on treatments, but not as much on prevention. And so I think if we can align the time horizons between multiple stakeholders, it's not 3-5 years, it's decades, then I think we can work towards that vision of really making cancer a disease of the past.
That's really helpful, actually, Rose. I was going to ask that as my next question, actually, because everything we've described is sort of it's the way you've described it is very constructive, but it's also quite a rosy picture. What I want to just go into a little bit now is where are the flies in the ointment, and that's one of them is perhaps where are the areas where we really aren't. I don't see how innovation or the market is applying itself well to, say, for example, areas of prevention. It's very difficult to monetize non-events. I don't see that there's any particular way that innovators are able to do that. So that's one area. And then another thing is maybe the really sticky areas where there is currently quite a lot of non-alignment. Again, Rose, you alluded to this tension sometimes between payers who obviously have not just cancer, they've got to deal with everything. They've got tight budgets, especially post-COVID, and access to some technologies and some treatments and so on can be very difficult, put in the swathe of opportunity costs that they then will have to stomach. So, and that's set against industry, who needs to obviously make returns to innovate and because it's a risky business innovating. So there are these sticky areas. So I'd just like to now get into those flies in the ointment. What's going to be tricky, and what are potential solutions? What are the really tricky areas? Again, open question to anyone. And let's be bold and honest about those.
So let me give you the example of my wife again. So I asked my wife the following: what if we would have a predictive model that would show that you had a likelihood of developing breast cancer, and that taking tamoxifen before you develop breast cancer, although it would cause chemical menopause and all the signs and symptoms associated with that, would actually prevent cancer from ever happening? And she said, if you told me at age 45 that I would be developing cancer at 50, I would take tamoxifen at age 45. And Mayo Clinic has now developed an 84-variable predictive model of identifying those women who are likely to develop breast cancer and who could benefit from therapy today to avoid it altogether. That's the kind of work we need to do.
Okay. All right. So that's an example of yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Add another part to what John just said, and you also alluded to it. So where we, sometimes feel the tension is in this access and reimbursement space. So this is an area often highlighted because, as you mentioned before, there is not an alignment of the needs between the regulators, the payers, and then the overall industry. The sad thing about this tension is, right, that what it leads to is delayed access for patients to treatment. If we look in Europe, for example, if we look at the data from EFPIA, the European Pharmaceutical Association, they do a survey with over 30 countries, and they identify countries where patients have to wait up to 2.5 years, right? In some countries, you would have access to treatment immediately. In others, because of the tensions you wait up to 2.5 years, and that's not really patient-centric. An example where we soon will have an opportunity to get it right and hopefully not make it into another risk for tension is that in Europe we're now moving into a pan-European joint clinical assessment. So at European level, we would do the clinical assessment for all countries. And we really hope that based on the dialogues that are going on right now, we will not create a situation where there would be delay for the patients, because we cannot just keep it at this European level, but some of the payers at country level would still require a second filing. So this is a very tangible example where we have a risk because of a potential second filing, creating a delay for patients. And that's the thing that all of us really want to avoid, because I think we are aligned in the goal of outsmarting cancer.
Well,
any other
from
thoughts?
the
Antonella, yeah.
On the patient, from the patient perspective, of course, prevention is would be the first priority step, because the best way to cure cancer is never to be diagnosed with cancer. No, so the best would be not develop a cancer disease. And this is so. This can. There are different ways to do this, and of course, we are not happy when we see that policymakers ignore so much the role of prevention in a diagnosis of cancer. And this is unfortunately often done as the investment in prevention is still very low. And so maybe one of the reasons for this is that there isn't yet enough awareness and evidence on the importance of prevention. Then to echo what Stephanie said, for us as a cancer patient organization, it is inconceivable to see that a treatment is available on day one in certain countries in Europe. And I mean, Stephanie mentioned 2 and 2.5 years, but there are countries in Europe which are really lacking behind, and the same treatment can be available even up to 12 years after. So, I mean, this is really to us unacceptable. And so so this is another reason why we really need to work together to make sure that there are no duplication. Like, for instance, in Europe now, there are about 50 different HTA bodies. So what is the rationale behind that? I mean, this is really duplicating the effort. It is wasting resources, but not only resources. What matters to us is that this is a waste of time for cancer patients to have access to a life-saving treatment. And then also I can mention that another challenge that we face is on survivorship and the cancer-related comorbidities. I mean, we have identified years ago the need of multidisciplinary teams to work with cancer patients and around cancer patients. But still, those multidisciplinary teams are very, very limited. And when it comes to survivorship, there are also stakeholders like there are issues like the financial stability, or the availability to go back, the possibility to go back to work for cancer patients. And it's very important that then we include as many stakeholders, but also that we give each stakeholder the right consideration even throughout the treatment of cancer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think if I may add something on this topic. So the point about the tension between profits and access, for us as investors, this is the tension that we have to deal with every day when we invest in companies. And even though we see exploding innovation in the industry, this tension is increasing so much that it can even threaten this whole ecosystem of innovation. We see many policymakers and lobby groups calling for tighter regulations around drug pricing, or even putting a cap on drug prices. But it's very difficult to balance such policies with the need to reward innovation, right? As a society, if we are unwilling to pay for transformative medicines, then they won't get invented. Now, I think there isn't a simple solution to fix this tension, because it involves many different parties and different incentives for different stakeholders. However, for us, one way that we are trying to go about this is investing in companies that can really lower the cost of drug discovery and drug development. When you look at the industry as a whole, the average success rate for drugs tested on humans is only 1 in 10 today. And that's a key reason for this high cost of drug development. But if we can increase that success rate to maybe 1 in 2, for example, that will massively bring down the cost of drug discovery, and that should translate into lower prices and hopefully better access for patients as well. So instead of focusing on companies that only work on a single asset and then trying to milk that asset as much as possible, we are hoping to invest in companies that can bring multiple drugs to the market, which have technology platforms that allow them to scale in a quick way. Because when you think about it, the more drugs a company believes it can bring to market, the less pressure it will feel to maximize the returns on a single drug. So I think the public investors and also private investors also have the responsibility to lessen this tension between profits and access by changing the way they invest in the industry.
Really interesting. I think, yeah.
May build on what Rosie just said. I think that yes, we have to consider costs and the prices, but we also need to consider what the treatment means in terms of investment, because sometimes there are treatments that are apparently more expensive than other treatments, but then in the long run, then they are not only life savings but also cost savings for payers or governments in Europe. So that is very important to consider. And unfortunately, I must say, it is not often on the radar of payers. So, like for instance, if we look at precision medicine, apparently, or biomarker testing, that is another big issue that we are facing lately. So biomarker testing is not accessible or reimbursed equally across Europe, but the potential of biomarker testings in terms of investment for the future of identifying, the right treatment for the patients. It's fundamental. It is very important, but it is too often undermined.
Interesting. I'm gonna. I think we're coming to now. You've identified a number of the key challenges to finding alignment and stakeholders working together. There is another one which we could explore, but I don't think there's time. Which is really around the political thing of different member states within Europe working together. Because you've alluded, Antonella, to HTA systems being different. Equity and access is quite variable. Outcomes are very variable, but probably there isn't time to go into that. I can't help but think that, and John, you probably agree and want to say something about this, that a lot of these issues can be addressed through better data and better analytics. So identifying unmet needs and signaling to the market that we need solutions, maybe accelerating and making R&D more efficient, finding efficiencies in care processes and reducing unwarranted variations in care through analyzing real-world data, and then enabling things like paying for outcomes rather than for volume, looking at the cost effectiveness, and the actual impact on outcomes using real world evidence. So it seems to me to enable this kind of stakeholder and enable that trust and that transparency and enable real work to be done in these areas you outlined, that data infrastructure and the analytics, and this is a shout out to sessions that are coming later in the conference, seems to me to be critical. Is this something, well, John, I think you're probably best placed to this, but I'm interested in everyone's thoughts on this.
Well, absolutely. And so any one institution's data is not sufficient to provide the real world evidence we need to get to new cures and to prevent the disease. So what does that mean? It means that we need to federate our data. We need the policies and technology in place and the cultural imperatives so that we can share data for cures and patient-focused treatments across multiple entities, including competitors. For example, though, there are going to be some novel data types that we're not gathering today. Mayo Clinic is now sequencing every tumor that is treated at Mayo Clinic. So we already have 1 million genomes, and we'll be getting thousands and thousands more. So figuring out how we're going to gather this new data, how from a policy perspective we're going to aggregate it and use it for the development of new cures. Finally, I'd like to say that as we look at this real-world evidence, we also have to take into account equity and social determinants of health. Really important. Mayo Clinic has looked at some cancers and looked at their distribution across geographies and income and education, race, ethnicity, and gender, and asked, are there interventions based on that evidence that we should make so that we're actually giving more care to areas that, for example, don't have access to care? What if we sent 50,000 Cologuard tests to patients who couldn't otherwise get colonoscopy and then took accountability for the follow-up and treatment of those who tested positive? That's the kind of social determinants of health we need for equitable care and to ensure that cancer is prevented or caught early.
Okay. So I think any other thoughts on this question? And also at the same time, I think we've got about 7 minutes left. We probably should now go to really closing thoughts from each of you in terms of what would you like to see in terms of stakeholders working together now that we've got the Beating Cancer Plan out, we've got these clear goals set for us. What would you actually like to see and how would you like to participate? And maybe even point to initiatives that you're already engaged with. That would be helpful too.
Let me start.
Okay, yes, Stephanie, go on. Stephanie, you were the first to speak.
Thank you, Vivek. Yeah. So, because for me, it comes down again to what I said right at the beginning, right? It's about collaboration, because if what you just mentioned and John alluded to, the data space, a pharmaceutical company cannot do that alone anymore, but we need it because, as Rose said, we really want to speed up of how we research and develop new treatments, because that's what it comes down to, right? And we have to collaborate across the board. And the second, as I said at the beginning, by really putting the patient in the center and have this data from all angles. The example I mentioned on patient-reported outcomes, the vision we have is like a public library, where John said it, even across competition, we can all access that data that at the end will really improve the patient outcomes. So collaboration as early as possible, as broad as possible, and then putting the patient in the center again and again.
Antonella, and maybe you could talk about things where you found that there has actually been great stakeholder engagement. Some examples would also be helpful, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, so for me, it's fundamental to work towards a multidisciplinary approach to cancer diagnosis and care. And to this extent, we have launched in 2020 an initiative on cancer-related complications and comorbidities. We started with just 2-3 partners, and now we have over 30 members to this initiative, including societies on, the European Cardiology Society or the Obesity Society, mental health, pain. So we are including all the other comorbidities around cancer. Then it is very important to strengthen even more the collaboration that already exists about the current stakeholders, from the design to the implementation and to clinical trials. We also need to strengthen the partnership on raising awareness and education towards patients, yes, but also towards policymakers, healthcare professionals, and the general population. And to this extent, for instance, if we look at the societal value of health, how many healthcare professionals are aware of the relevance of the societal value of an health intervention? So this is it's very important to increase health literacy on not so given for granted topics. And then, of course, we also need to partner on advocacy. We do need to support more each other towards the ultimate goal of benefiting cancer patients. And I can also mention another initiative that we are launching soon. On this initiative, we are working together with EFPIA, the European Pharmaceutical Association. We are setting up a task force on personalized medicine to support the implementation of the Europe's Beating Cancer Plan, as there are many angles looking at many individual stakeholders promoting a personalized medicine. But we believe that to this extent we need to join forces so to have a united voice providing support to the implementation of Europe's Beating Cancer Plan.
Thank you. And John, and then Rose. And Rose, you can have the final word. John, any sort of key takeaways that you would like to leave with us from this session?
Sure. So I may be a physician and a digital health expert, but I'm also a husband, a father, and a son. And ask yourself the question, if you're the care navigator for multiple generations, what's the cancer prevention work you would want done for those you love? So I ask myself the question, if we're going to change, we need a guiding coalition for change. That means government, academia, and industry working together on technology and policy cultural change. I see this world, of course, having essential data components. And I look forward to a future where we, through the use of phenotype and genotype and exposome, understand the likelihood of cancer across all social determinants of health and are making interventions to prevent and to more precisely cure.
And Rose, key takeaways.
So I would wish to see much better collaboration and communication between the private sector and the public sector in order to work towards the common vision of preventing and curing cancers. I think for us as investors, what we are trying to achieve here is not just delivering financial returns for our clients, but also delivering impact on the society. And we believe that by investing in companies that can bring transformative medicines and accessible medicines to patients, the financial returns will follow as a result. However, when you look at the ecosystem in Europe in particular, there is still a lot of bottleneck in terms of the capital market. There is not sufficient long-term capital out there to support companies and support the translation of research from academia to public companies. And so we need to work together and get all of these like-minded investors together so we can give the companies the best chance to realize their visions. So we have a couple of initiatives going on where we are partnering with policymakers in the UK, and we are also talking to other investors in Europe to bring everyone on the table And so we can, instead of, for example, giving companies a little bit of money every time they hit a milestone, perhaps we can give companies ample financing upfront so they can develop their platforms and their science, before going down to developing their, specific assets or pipeline. And also, instead of focusing on exit route, in the near term by selling out to, a larger entity, or, getting acquired, we can give the companies the best chance to become a long-lasting independent company that can bring multiple drugs to market. And so that way, on one hand, we can bring better drugs to patients. On the other hand, we can also lower the cost of development and potentially lower pricing as well. So that's kind of an initiative that within Baillie Gifford we are striving to work towards too.
Well, look, we're out of time, but I want to really express my thanks to all of you for joining us for a really, really good discussion, which sets us up very well actually for the many of the themes that we'll be covering in our conference. So really grateful to you all, and thank you very much for joining me today.